Thank you, Mayor Wong. That was informative and inspiring. And I'd like everyone to join me in giving her a hand. We're running a little late, and I think that probably the best thing to do, even though I have my notes here, the best thing for me to do is to get out of my own way and move on to our panel. What I'm going to do is introduce myself and make one general observation about our subject, gateway cities, and then introduce our panelists. Then we will, each of them will speak for about 10 minutes, and then we'll open the floor up for questions. Sound good? My name is Catherine Tumber, and I'm a historian and journalist. 2 years ago, I published a book called Small Gritty and Green, The Promise of America's Smaller Industrial Cities in a Low-Carbon World with the MIT Press. And I have continued to study this rich and long-neglected subject as a visiting scholar here at the School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs. My interest in these places is rooted in deep personal experience. I spent most of my life in Rochester and Syracuse, New York. And over the course of 30 years, I watched these cities fail and fall into shocking decline. When I moved to Massachusetts 15 years ago, I brought my love of these places with me, and I've paid close attention to our gateway cities here in Massachusetts, which haven't fallen on quite as difficult times as these cities in the high Rust Belt. But still, they have had their share of troubles. What I would like to emphasize here, drawing on what Lisa said, is I've traveled a lot. My book is a work of historical research, but also of reporting. And I traveled to 25 cities to write the book, and since then I have been to even more of these smaller cities throughout the Northeast and Midwest to give talks on it. And each time I go to one, I make sure that I get to know the city. I spend an extra day and tour the city and get to know some of the people. And one of the things that's really striking to me, I think it's really quite fair to say, that Massachusetts is truly a pioneer in this area, dating back as far away as the Dukakis administrations. And the programs that Mayor Wong alluded to are really, as far as I know, unique. We are the only, and some of the people on our panel will be discussing them, the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston's Working Cities Challenge is the first of its kind in the country. It's a prototype that may be imitated by other Federal Reserve banks across the country. So it's a first of its kind thing. The mayors, there was in 2008, on the heels of a Brookings Institution report, and also the Massachusetts for an Institute for a New Commonwealth, a group of 11 mayors got together and decided to work as a consortium to advance their interests and to make the claim that they worked better together than separately, especially in a state with such an economic powerhouse in Boston. So that was, as far as I know, unprecedented, and I don't think any other city any other state is doing this kind of coordination. I know of no other state think tank that has its own program devoted to its smaller industrial cities. The Patrick administration has been really very focused on gateway cities. We actually have, as far as I can tell, we are the only state that has an assistant secretary dedicated to linking and defending the interests of these gateway cities. So Massachusetts has a lot to offer, and a lot of people across the country are watching what we're doing here. So with that, please allow me to introduce our illustrious panel. Ben Forman is the research director of Mass Inc., and he is also the director of Mass Inc.'s Gateway Cities Innovation Institute. And he's going to be talking to us about their programs and the arc of their work. Tamar Kotelchuck is the program manager for the Working Cities Challenge Initiative of the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston. Arthur Jemison is the Deputy Undersecretary of the Massachusetts Department of Housing and Community Development. Maggie Church is a Community Development and Sustainability Consultant and the Board Chair of Groundwork USA. And last but not least, Jen Lammers is the National Program Director of the Alliance for Nonprofit Management. So without further ado, I turn this panel over to them. Ben?
Good morning, and thank you very much, Kathy. I'll quickly, I guess, try and cover some of the economic factors, policy factors, and political factors that we've encountered in the last 7 years of our work, which has been almost entirely focused on gateway cities. I think Mayor Wong did an excellent job of covering this. I hope I'm not repetitive, and I know I can't be nearly as powerful, as eloquent as she. But maybe I can give you a little bit of sort of I don't know. Let me just get into it and see how it goes. From an economic perspective, if you know Mass Inc., we're a nonprofit public policy research organization. We're independent, nonpartisan, but our mission is promoting the growth and vitality of the state's middle class. And I think one important way of looking at that is gateway cities have been the ladders to the middle class for generations of families in our Commonwealth. And we've done a lot of work with Andy Sum, an economist here at Northeastern, and he's sort of shown us that every time Massachusetts comes out of a recession, it comes out a little faster than the rest of the country, but then it loses steam faster than the rest of the country. And our higher educated folks, their unemployment rates come down rapidly, their incomes start to go again, and everybody from the middle percentile on down make no gains or they lose ground. And because of that, over the last 3 or 4 decades, we've gone from the state with the least inequality, or one of the states with the least inequality in the nation, to the state, or one of the states with the most inequality. And that plays out geographically a lot of different ways. Obviously, there's a big east-west issue with the western part of the state not really driving a lot of growth of late. But within each regional economy, we also see geographically more and more inequality. People separating themselves into wealthy neighborhoods and very disadvantaged neighborhoods. And that starts to self-perpetuate. And of course, the disadvantaged neighborhoods are in our gateway cities, the places that were once the ladders of economic mobility. And I think, opportunity really does have a place to mention. It's amazing how close real economic prosperity can be to you, and yet you have a difficult time connecting to it. And that's a real problem for the state, I think, long term, and one of the reasons why our economy doesn't grow more robustly when we have strong growth cycles, because one, we've got a lot of accumulated assets in these cities. All of our infrastructure, all of our institutions are located there. But most importantly, our people are located there. 1 out of 4 residents in our Commonwealth lives in a gateway city today. And in fact, it's 1 out of 3 very young residents. So the future lies there, and the future is disconnected from economic opportunity and not seeing the kinds of mobility that they had in the past. And I think that doesn't bode very long for our long-term finances or economic future. And so that's kind of where we've come to it, at it from an economic perspective. And then when you start to think, okay, what's the policy framework for trying to change this dynamic when you're looking at it as a state? Obviously, the federal government's retreated from some of this work over the last years, and the communities in our Commonwealth just don't have the capacity in any sense. They don't have the tax tools. More so than most states, we restrict their ability to generate their own revenue, so that they're really relying on the state to provide solutions. And when you start to look at state policy, policy by policy, you see an obvious bias towards the greater Boston region. I think one good example that we've heard a lot about recently is transportation policy. When every extra dime that we can find goes into this region because of its dire needs, we use statewide revenues to pay for that, and we cut back again and again on transportation service in regions outside of Boston. I think you'd find the same thing when you look at education policy, when you look at how we use public universities in particular, and you ask, why are we ranking somewhere 44th, 45th, 46th on state spending for public universities? Obviously, there's a lot of private universities and families with wealth to use them in one part of the state, and in other parts of the state, there's very heavy reliance on underfunded public universities. So another example is when you look at housing policy. I think you see a lot of tools that were designed to deal with very strong housing markets in greater Boston, where we have an obvious affordable housing crisis, and that is probably one of our greatest drags on growth in this part of the state. But the needs of housing markets in places like Springfield and Worcester and Fitchburg are very different. So I think that really speaks to why the mayors felt so compelled to join forces and start to think about what are the policy tools that are appropriate for our communities and will serve them best as they try to move forward. And that kind of brings to the last point, the political dimension. How do gateway cities work together politically? How many votes do they have? Can they really move an agenda at the state level? And they've been working at it now for 6 or 7 years. They've got a fairly strong Gateway Cities caucus that's formed. It's great to see the Gateway City caucus members tour each other's cities and get to know one another. And they've written 2 pieces of legislation together now. But I think, as you know, the dynamics at the State House are challenging when you're talking about working in that sort of coalition. Communities each have their own needs, and sometimes their own needs can be more compelling, and it takes a lot of strength to be in it for the long term and stay sort of lockstep in hand. If they are able to do that, though, and I think there really are signs that as the Gateway Cities movement grows more mature, the caucus and their legislative might is growing. I think there really is an interesting long-term scenario where you've got a quarter of the state in Gateway Cities, you've got a quarter of the state in Boston in the inner core. You have a true urban coalition now that could advance real urban policy in Massachusetts. So that's something that we're looking forward to seeing, and I think it's already starting to happen. Obviously, Gateway Cities and the core cities will have to find some common ground, but I think if they can work together in real dialogue as mayors, there's real potential there in the long term. So I just want to finish by making a few observations about philanthropy in all this mix. And I think one way to think about it is through the Gateway Cities vision, which Mayor Wong mentioned. The Gateway Cities vision, I think, is 3 things. One, it's language, and that's what Mayor Wong talked mostly about, to communicate the needs of Gateway City schools and the opportunities of them. Mid-sized cities actually have some exceptional strengths as learning systems, and we look at them as sort of places that have failing schools or bad schools, when actually they're communities that have great youth development organizations, great workforce development organizations, great presence of higher ed. They've got great institutions. They've got a lot of the raw materials that would make for exceptional learning systems. And one among them is their students, as Mayor Wong has mentioned, their diversity and their strengths that are often overlooked. So one part is communicating that. And a second part is actually thinking about, if we as Gateway City educators were making state policy, what were the things we would want to see? And we're kind of working on that slowly. It's taking, education is obviously a very complex question, so it takes a lot of time to build consensus around a shared agenda, but that's coming. The third part that I think is most interesting to philanthropy is the idea of collaborative impact. I think the vision outlines a bunch of best practices that communities on themselves, with the right policies, will need to implement. And I think it's got to be data-driven. And there needs to be a lot of assistance putting these programs in place. And I think philanthropy has an important role. And if you're familiar with collaborative impact work in other cities around the country, especially the work that's been done by Strive, a lot of it has been organizing philanthropic dollars to make sure that they're invested to get the best returns. I think with our gateway cities, we need to think about it slightly differently because there aren't a lot of philanthropic dollars around. And so in a lot of ways, the return they're going to get is demonstrating things out so that we could advance them in terms of state policy and better state investment. And that's a really important lens that we need to work together looking through. The idea that there's practice that we can put in place, measure, demonstrate return on investment, and then scale that working together with our gateway city legislators.
Thank you, Ben. I'd like to just jump in and say one more thing related to the work of Mass Inc. Mass Inc. has put out a series of reports that are rich with data and policy suggestions. And if you go to their website, massinc.com, right? And go to the Gateway Cities page, you'll find a wealth of information there. Reports on transportation, on a recent one on immigrant entrepreneurship in these cities, education, vision of education that Mayor Wong talked about. So I highly recommend that. So next, we'd like to hear from Tamar Kotelchuck, Federal Reserve Bank of Boston.
Good morning. I'm Tamar Kotelchuck. I'm the director of the Working Cities Challenge for the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston. I think after listening to this morning's comments, I'm going to create a subtitle for the Working Cities Challenge, which is Working Cities Challenge, It's Hard to Do Things Alone. So thank you for that, Mayor Wong. We are a competition with a monetary prize created to support economic resurgence in the gateway cities. And specifically, we seek to do this by spurring collaborative leadership. No Federal Reserve Bank has ever run a competition before or given away prize money. This is a completely new model, which we are very excited about, and Federal Reserves around the country, I think, are also very excited about. We were pleased to have Janet Yellen discuss the Working Cities Challenge as a promising model last week in her first address about poverty after being named chair. So why would we do this? The Federal Reserve Bank of Boston is deeply committed to the economic strength of gateway cities. New England as a region cannot prosper if these cities are performing below their full potential. They contain 25% of the population and 40% of the poverty in Massachusetts. To be quite candid, and as Ben so aptly pointed out, not enough resources and institutions are focused on the gateway cities, and we think that the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston can be a meaningful part of addressing that lack of resources. So, we all know that the Federal Reserve cares about economic strength, but why would our competition focus on something that could be perceived as squishy, such as collaborative leadership? The answer is that collaboration may be squishy, but its economic impact is hard and clear. As part of a 5-year engagement in Springfield, Massachusetts in the early 2000s, our economic research department did a national study of small post-industrial cities. We asked the question, do any of these cities do well? And if they do well, why is that? And this was done by economists, not by community development folks. I think that they expected to find that the answer would be anchor institutions, education of your populations. And those things are important, but they don't matter across the board. So if you look at who's successful and who's not, there is not a single economic factor that explains which cities do well. The single factor that is consistent across the board is collaboration and leadership. And specifically what that means is within a community, you need the public sector, the private sector, the nonprofit sector, and community residents focused on the same vision and the same goal. And you need a champion or multiple champions who won't let that vision die and who are committed to making sure that it's successful. So we set about trying to spur collaborative leadership and to track its impact on economic resurgence. The challenge is a collaboration itself. It brings together 3 funding partners. To back up a moment, the Federal Reserve cannot use its money for grants. We're providing leadership, we manage the challenge, we do the research, and we designed the challenge with our partners. But because we can't do that ourselves, we had to bring together partners to provide the grant funds. And the partners that came together were Living Cities, which is a national collaboration of the biggest foundations in the US, Gates, Pew, Ford, etc. The Mass Competitive Partnership, which is an association of the 16 largest employers in Massachusetts. So this is partners, Suffolk Construction, State Street, and the state, and its development arm, Mass Development, along with some other foundation partners like HIAMS, the Boston Foundation, and the Ford and Cerdna Foundations. They created a pool of prizes, and they helped us design this challenge. And I think it's important to just note that such a powerful and diverse partnership of actors really all see the importance of collaboration and leadership. So the Mass Competitive Partnership, for example, business leaders, one wouldn't necessarily expect to see them investing in collaboration, but they've tried to work in these places, and they know, I think instinctively, that their investments only work where capable leadership exists on the ground to absorb the investments and make them work locally. So together we created a competitive process to identify promising initiatives that advance collaborative leadership. And my instinct was to talk about the process a bit, but I think I want to fast forward to talk more about the collaboratives that came out of it. I guess a few key elements of the design were: only teams could apply to the Working Cities Challenge. Each team had to have public, private, and nonprofit partners. We only would accept 1 application per city. So we didn't say what the topic area was. We didn't say you have to focus on education or youth or workforce. We said you choose the priority as long as it has a positive impact on low-income people and it's a high priority locally. But you all have to decide what the highest priority is. We're not going to dictate that, and furthermore, we're not going to choose it. So there were a number of cities that said, we have so many ideas, we'll give them to you and you decide what's best. And we said, no, local collaborative leadership is really about the conversation. What is your highest priority? What are your opportunities right now? And we've gotten feedback from the applicant teams that has been a new conversation, sitting down in advance of the application to say, what is our highest priority as a community that impacts low-income people, was difficult and painful in some cases, but has led to work that is continuing even in the cities that didn't win. So what we got were a variety of very promising initiatives in workforce, in immigrant entrepreneurship, in education, and in data-driven community development. The winners were selected by a jury of experts. The Fed doesn't choose winners itself. And what we have are some very exciting efforts that deserve our attention. And there's not time to review them all, but I want to touch on just 2. Lawrence and Fitchburg. So Lawrence is one of the lower income and most densely immigrant cities among the Gateway Cities cohort. They're at a historic moment. They have a long underperforming school system, which is under receivership right now, and the residents have just elected a young, talented, reform-minded new mayor. So what's the highest priority for the Lawrence community under these circumstances? The answer is the schools. They're tremendously important to family economic success, and they have new, innovative leadership. So in this context, a team led by Lawrence Community Works and the receiver of the schools came together, and their goal is to improve family economic outcomes, to improve the income of families by 15% over the next 15 years, and to support parent engagement in the schools. National research shows that both of those things are absolutely critical to urban school turnarounds. And Lawrence, which has a very strong nonprofit sector, feels like they're ideally positioned to coordinate those services to deliver that kind of impact. They're going to create a family resource center that is going to touch every single parent in the Lawrence Public School system, so that's 9,500 parents. And the Working Cities Challenge is going to allow them to focus on employment supports. They have very impressive engagement from some of the largest employers in the city of Lawrence, including the Lawrence Health Center, New Balance, Selectria Renewables, and they're saying that they want to create a pipeline for local employees through this school system. A second and really interesting model, and one of our winners, is Fitchburg. Mayor Lisa Wong, you heard from this morning. I think that what's most exciting about the Fitchburg proposal to us is the idea that together they will develop metrics of change for one low-income community, and that they will make decisions about public spending and where nonprofits spend their time depending on what they can show to work in that one neighborhood. So they're developing what they call an economics report card focused on 6 indicators of positive change for the neighborhood, with the goal of making the neighborhood a place to live, work, and invest. They have an impressive team led by Mayor Wong, including the Massachusetts Opportunity Council, the Twin Cities CDC, and Fitchburg State University. And we think that this effort is particularly promising because of the success that they've had in coordinating their work and measuring their outcomes around childhood obesity. So they're saying, let's take that approach and let's apply it to one low-income neighborhood and really measure the change over time. And let's use that to decide how we invest the rest of our money, both publicly and from a philanthropic perspective. So a last note, we are going to stay with these communities, both the winning communities and the non-winning communities, for the 3 years of our initiative. We are committed to organizing and facilitating private investment in these communities as well. And as part of that, we're hoping to explore a funders network, including ourselves, our major funders, and other philanthropists that are interested in investing in the gateway cities as a platform. And so with that, I think I will pass it on to one of our esteemed partners in the Working Cities Challenge, Arthur Jemison.
I have one brief comment here. I believe that we have on the literature table over here a list of all of the winners of the Working Cities Challenge program. So if you're interested in learning more, with descriptions of their projects. So if you're interested in learning more, you have a resource right there. Okay, Arthur.
Good morning, everybody. It is a good morning. Spring's finally here. I'm going to add just a few points. I think one of the things I do want to say that I think is very important is just that the folks who've spoken, including the mayor, Tamar, Ben, and the people who are going to speak, specifically Maggie, have been involved in this work in gateway cities in different ways for many, many years, and it's been my pleasure to collaborate with them both as a private business person and now in government. And I think many of the things they're talking about today are not just things they've sort of talking about now in a policy sense. They're things they've been involved in implementing personally. So that matters a lot, and I think it comes through when you hear folks talk. So just to give you a little bit of background, I'm the deputy director of a state agency called Department of Housing and Community Development. We're the allocator of most of the affordable housing resources in the state. We're the controller of a portfolio of Section 8 and MRVP housing vouchers. We've got planning and land use policy and incentives in our operation, as well as the state's shelter system, and we coordinate and work with all of the quasi-public agencies like Mass Housing Partnership, MHIC, a number of other agencies, and lenders around the state, just to give you a sense of what the scope of what we do is and the ways that we're involved. I was asked to talk a little bit about why the state is so interested in gateway cities. I think it's been said more eloquently than I could say here already, but I think maybe the most interesting thing that's been said to me about why we're involved that sort of encapsulates it. A veteran community development actor, Lou Vinfer, came to see Aaron, the Undersecretary, and I recently, it's got to be about a year ago, and said, you know, how would the state react if there was one city that was doing very well and had great initiatives on all the major factors, poverty, great initiatives about growing jobs, great initiatives about housing. And there was a second city that was twice as large that didn't have any of that organization. It didn't have any of those, had many assets, but it didn't have any of that drive, any of that innovation. That's what gets me up in the morning. I think that's really what sort of has drawn the attention of the state, is that, as has been said earlier, 25% of the people in the state live in gateway cities. They have 40% of the poverty and indices associated with it. It is what gets us up in the morning and what gives us a bit of urgency, because if we had a second city like that in the state, the response would be not only what it is, but it would be some of the other things you're hearing about here today, a Working Cities Challenge, some of the other efforts I'm going to focus on. So that's why I think the next thing I was asked to talk about categorically was what's working. And I think I'll talk a little bit about the ways that the state has invested in gateways historically. But I think the best way to start the conversation about that is to indicate that when we came on board, specifically the Patrick administration, I think that we found that the strategy with gateway cities was not focused on the things that make them strong. It was focused very much on the things that have caused them to be weak over time. And the response had been, well, you're having a hard time, let me give you something that you ask for. Not always spending potentially as much time evaluating exactly how that's going to build on what's strong about the community. I think what we've tried to do at the state over the last 8 years is listen to and engage with communities, but try to respond as vigorously as we can in areas where they say, look, this is, yes, my community's poor. Yes, my community has some challenges, maybe has some leadership challenges. But this is the part of the economy that grows jobs, is best connected to positive outcomes for young people. We're going to invest in that. So I think when you look at the things that we've spent our time and money on over the last few years, you'll see that theme. I want to talk about 4 places very briefly that I think give people a sense of the ways that the gateways the categories that they break down into. I think earlier Ben Forman was describing weak markets. And I think something it really is a distinction. There are places that have weak housing or commercial markets, and places that have stronger ones. Specifically, those in the in sort of the pole and the tractor beam of the Boston market, places like Chelsea. There are opportunities associated with the change in the demographic population living in rental or for sale housing in cities that they can take advantage of, that they're uniquely positioned to take advantage of. And when you go to places like Chelsea and look at what they have on the docket and what they're doing, you can see that they are strategically taking advantage of their proximity to Boston and trying to bring jobs and new housing to those communities. Then when you look at a place like Lawrence, which 2 of my colleagues here have extensive experience in, you're really able to see the power of a community development corporation and the power of frankly bringing the community together. That's a place that has because of its proximity to the major beltways where there's significant job growth over the last 2 generations. They're really in a position to take advantage to some degree of the strength of the larger Greater Boston marketplace, and they're doing it. Not only they're doing it increasingly with the new mayor, but they've also done it in the past, really bringing some innovative approaches to engaging the population in the community and really growing what has to be one of the strongest community development corporations in the state. So then talking a little bit about places that are outside of the Boston market, Holyoke is a place where the Commonwealth has significantly invested in a new facility that's going to allow them to capture this new market. People here probably know more about it than I do, but big data and the computing power that's required to get to use big data for the benefit of the marketplace. They have a new green computing center there that uses the power of the Holyoke's water power to basically provide a low-cost option for people to, again, you do the calculations required to cause big data to make money for folks. That's something that's been invested in significantly. I think we might have $20 million invested in that facility. What's been exciting there is that we think that the mayor who's been a partner to the state for this is his second term, is energizing people, attracting business, and has also been really focused on some of the other parts of our business, like the physical redevelopment of public housing, that's right next to City Hall, right next to the computing center. They've been very successful. So a final place I want to talk about is a little bit farther out. I'm not sure how many of you folks have been to Pittsfield. It's a place I've spent a lot of time. It's on the far western part of the state, and it's a place where, frankly, the arts have really become a major focus, and it's a place where we've started to see some real new shoots of development in the downtown district. So in each one of these cases, I think what we've tried to do is respond to the communities in the ways that they've been able to say, look, this is a strength. This is how we're going to get stronger and better. We want to partner with you. That's the way we've done it. I also want to say a couple more things about the way that our agency gets to partner. One of the challenges to us is, we're focused on the physical development side. We're focused on housing, and as the mayor and others have touched on, there are limitations to what housing can do. By way of example, over the last 10 years, we've spent about 30% of the money, and that's all of the money, the bond allocations, tax credits. We've spent a very significant percentage of those dollars preserving and developing housing in the gateway cities. And we're proud of that. But I think we know that that's not it. And we know that if we spend 100%, that wouldn't be it. I think that's one of the reasons that when we were approached by the Federal Reserve about this collective impact model that really brings, frankly, a lot of the municipal functions that aren't physical together, we were really excited. I think that it's been a limitation in our field, the idea that a housing development in and of itself, without the programming and engagement of residents that's required, is going to transform the outcomes of the people in the community. So when we were presented with a new way of approaching that, we were lead investors, and we're proud to say we're part of, not quite at the same level as Living Cities or others, but we're proud to say we're part of that, because it's really about the part of the business that we can't necessarily touch as quickly. So I just wanted to add one last thing, kind of that everyone's been including a sort of message to philanthropy. I guess what I'd say for our side of the business is that the physical side is that if you look at the trend, the charts that show you where the trends have been in funding affordable housing and planning and all the other things that make our cities great physically, the trend's down. In fact, sometimes we have a struggle in our office about trying to find the right chart, because if you only go back 10 years, yes, it's down. But if you go back 20 years, you see that it's down by an order of magnitude. So one of the sort of Manhattan projects, so to speak, of our business is trying to attract and connect with the resources that are directly outside of housing. So areas like health, areas like energy and transportation, where things sometimes move at a different pace. We can start and get a project done relatively quickly. Transportation, major changes in health, and access to energy resources takes different time. But in fact, housing is really the scene where a lot of the progress that we're hoping we'll be able to see out of the working cities, those person-to-person interactions, housing is really the scene where that happens. It's also the scene where the place where we're going to be able to conserve very significant resources as we think about climate change. It's also the place where if it's designed correctly and if it's monitored and measured correctly, the place where we're going to see great housing can have huge impacts on health outcomes. So what I think we're trying to do, and I would ask philanthropy to do, is as we begin to experiment with things like Chelsea, another community that was selected under Working Cities, Roca has got this great approach to reducing recidivism among youth. As we begin to look at ways to bring other resources categorically into the housing business, I guess I'd ask philanthropy to help us support those, because we hope that there continues to be interest and focus on bringing new money into the housing sector, but we're also being resourceful and trying to think about how to bring those other resources that we create the scene for progress on to be brought into our sector. So with that, I'll pass it back to Catherine and then back to you, Maggie.
Maggie Superchurch.
Oh, two microphones. I guess I'll use this one. Yeah, that's fine. So thank you. Good morning. I'm going to try and keep my remarks relatively brief, but I wanted to talk about how in communities around the country, but also particularly in Massachusetts, how you go about the business of actually creating the kind of civic leadership, civic infrastructure, resident engagement that is really the foundation for a lot of the kinds of initiatives and change work that others on the panel have talked about. So, you know, in places where there's a real need for deeper engagement, and also places where some of that has started to happen, there are a lot of tools to help think about how we advance that work and scale it up. So I wanted to speak about one of those today, which is an organization called Groundwork USA, which is a national umbrella for a number of organizations across the country. And I'm the board chair for Groundwork USA. I actually just got back from our national conference last week and continue to be inspired by the great work that's happening around the country. But Groundwork has very strong roots in Massachusetts. Groundwork trusts, as they're called, are independent 501c3s, and of the first three created in the U.S., one was in Massachusetts in Lawrence. We also now have a trust in Somerville and a new effort underway in Fall River, New Bedford. And the organization has roots in a partnership that began actually over a decade ago between the National Park Service and EPA, who are both trying to understand how to reach communities in greatest need. So for EPA's perspective, they were doing a lot of work on brownfields, but really largely funding sort of the larger transformation projects, which are very important, but which weren't typically reaching a lot of low-income neighborhoods or serving low-income people. The Park Service, for its part, had a great Rivers and Trails program, but similarly were not reaching communities, many of which were struggling with polluted waterways, vacant lots, and where they would like to have a presence. They actually went to the UK, which had had a groundwork program underway for many years prior, aimed at addressing many of the same challenges in similar kinds of communities. And so they brought the model here, and really was one of the early examples of cross-sector partnership from the federal government, from local government, from community organizations, and from businesses. And so the model essentially is one that focuses on bringing folks in communities together to address the challenges that they face in their neighborhoods and in their communities, but particularly looking at environmental challenges. So, you know, it's not an accident that in many of the places where people are really struggling with poverty, with unemployment, we also see that there have been sort of a significant history of environmental degradation. So as we look across the country, a lot of that is focused in the smaller and mid-sized cities that had significant industrial activity and a legacy of industrial contamination. Neighborhoods within larger cities where industry was concentrated and which have been and in many cases continue to be left behind by economic growth in the larger metro. And also rural communities that have been and continue to struggle with mining activity and the legacy of very large-scale industry. And so in those places where all of those challenges sort of come together, Groundwork is a place to think about how you engage people in sort of starting with some very small efforts and scaling those up to really create stronger civic infrastructure and improve quality of life. So in practical terms, what that has involved is a sort of dual focus on people and place, and so looking at how some of these historic liabilities in terms of polluted land, polluted water can be transformed into assets. And there's some great examples in Massachusetts and around the country where these sort of natural assets have been converted into great community resources. So turning brownfields into parks, creating new greenways that support community health, developing community gardens and farmers markets, a very strong emphasis on youth and youth engagement as new leaders for sort of the next generation in these communities, which has been a very, very powerful part of the work. And in many cases, those youth are involved in advocating for some of these broader efforts, testifying at city council, doing water quality monitoring, and really taking ownership of the future of their communities in some very important ways. And part of what's really terrific about the model is that it allows anyone to participate. So regardless of who you are, where you live, how old or young you are, there is something you can do. You can show up to a cleanup, you can plant a tree, you can participate in a summer program with your children, you can show up for a kite festival. And so these are the sort of touch points that help to build community and that give people a sense of ownership and connection. And so it's been a really powerful effort. Groundwork Trust work closely with community development corporations, with transportation advocates, with others in their communities across sectors, as well as with city government, to advance some of these projects. So it's very much a boots on the ground effort, and I think speaks to how we begin to address change in some of the places where it's needed most, and how we build the kinds of collaborative leadership that others on the panel have talked about. So, I think the pictures and the videos do much more justice than I could do, so I would direct you to the website, which is groundworkusa.org. There are links to the local trusts in Massachusetts and around the country. The network is growing. There's a competitive national process every year. We have 3 new trusts in the feasibility stage in Atlanta, Georgia, in Jacksonville, Florida, and in Indianapolis. And we look forward to progress with those and with others as they come into the network. So I'd be happy to talk with folks more about it, but we really believe that creating that kind of civic engagement and quality of life is foundational for the change that we hope to see in many of these places.
Thanks, Maggie. Now we're on to Jen Lammers.
So I'm with the Alliance for Nonprofit Management, and the Alliance is a national knowledge community of funders, consultants, academics, and nonprofit leaders who are really focused on understanding how we can build the capacity of individuals, organizations, and communities so that they can achieve positive and lasting social change. So by bringing thinkers from across the community together to look at the practices that really do increase communities' capacity to not just deliver a certain number of meals or educate a certain number of students or build a certain number of low-income housing units, but actually create the type of change that makes these communities thriving, lasting, and vibrant communities. And the reason I'm sort of batting cleanup here is to say, what if you're not a funder who's investing in one of the gateway cities? Or what if you're a nonprofit leader or future nonprofit leader who isn't located in one of these areas? What are the lessons that these great examples can sort of give us as we think about future strategies and future ways to affect positive change? And the really exciting thing is that the axiom, necessity is the mother of invention, is really true. When you look at these communities, they do not necessarily have what has been referred to as the luxury of a significant and large traditional philanthropic population. It's not that they don't have resources, but they're not the resources that we traditionally think of when we think of foundations and philanthropy. And out of that, they've had to develop strategies to make the most of the resources they have and affect change without necessarily the big dollar grant attached to it. And the really exciting thing is that the strategies that are bubbling up out of these communities are the strategies that the rest of the social change industry world is looking at and saying, aha, that's what's working. That's what we want to see as a model throughout philanthropy, throughout cities, not just the small cities, but in local communities, in neighborhoods, and in large urban areas. And so from today's conversation and talking to our panelists as we led up to this, I want to say that there are really 4 areas, and the really exciting thing to me is they're the 4 areas that the Alliance members are researching, writing on, and reporting on. And so I want, when you think as you go through the day and think about your own strategies, think about how advocacy and the connection with government is really changing the way these cities are achieving change. Lobbying, yes, that dirty word in the nonprofit sector, is a necessity. Informing government about what is going on in the front lines, allowing nonprofits to be the voices of their communities is really important, and funders need to get comfort with that. There's also the connection to government, which isn't the direct lobbying, but it's having that access, that ability to have a conversation with your mayor, that ability to talk to the head of an agency that's moving resources towards housing or towards the environment is essential for nonprofits to be able to achieve change. The second thing, community engagement. Community engagement is essential. The size and scope of philanthropy in these local communities is not such that a paternalistic institution can hand out the change or the renewal or the intervention that they're asking for. It has to be owned. It has to be pushed up from the community. And we talk about that now in terms of creating cultural shifts. not necessarily changing or feeding or delivering one item of social good, but creating a social change, a cultural shift where obesity is not acceptable, that teen pregnancy or teen parents are supported, that smoking is bad. These are not things that we can continue to fund day in and day out. These are things that as a community we have to adopt. And there are countless other examples. So looking at your strategy, both as a philanthropist and as a nonprofit leader, that isn't just about delivering the change, alleviating the problem, putting your finger in the dike, but is also incorporating ways to connect with the community and change the way we think about justice. Think of the way we think about equality. And that's what's happening in these communities. The entire community is being engaged in the change we seek. The third we heard about, and I think is really, really important, is collaboration. And we've heard about that from the funding community for years. We want to see collaborations. We want you to work together. What's happening now is the actual collaborative process, the building of trust, the creating of creative coalitions is being funded, is being supported. That in of itself is a good. We call it relationships as capacity. It's amazing what you can get done when you're sitting next to some of the smartest, most motivated, most dedicated people in your community. And as you've said, I've heard a number of people say, those conversations themselves, even if it didn't lead to an award-winning application, the conversation itself with someone who was outside of their silo brought change, brought progress. And we have to encourage that. We have to encourage a cross-pollination of conversations. And lastly, data and measurement, both access to indicators, access to the data that tells us what's going on in our cities, what's going on in our environment, and then the ability to measure what our own impact and abilities are. And investing in that core capacity in the social change sector is really essential. So again, the four themes that I think we really see through the people who've talked today, and I think are really marking a trend and a change in the way philanthropy is happening, the way we are pursuing social change. Effective advocacy, community engagement that leads to meaningful cultural shifts, collaborations and creative partnering, and data and measurement. And so I can say that those are the themes. The one thing I want you to take away, though, is that there is no one size fits all. Just because it works in Fitchburg, the way it works in Fitchburg, it may not work the same way in Somerville. It may not work the same way in Holyoke. And so while we look at these themes, I think it's essential for us as investors in social change to allow for customization, to allow for there to be tweaks and regional differences in the overall goals. And I'm going to end with what I call, it's either the microbrewery or the pizza analogy. We all can agree about the basic product. We know a pizza or a beer when we see one. But what really gets people fired up, what really gives them ownership, is the regional flavor. The things that we do differently. You talk to a New Yorker about their pizza, and they don't even want to know they don't even think Boston has pizza. You talk to somebody from Chicago, and I do not know what that messy thing that comes in a pan this thick is. But they love it. They're passionate about it. They want you to try it. They want you to love it. And there are people that, it's what drives people to go try different things. So while we can all agree what collaboration, community engagement, advocacy, and data measurement are going to look like, I cannot tell you what the regional flavor will be, and that's up to you if you are making a commitment to invest in these communities, to understand, support, and encourage.
Thank you, Jen, for tying things up. At this point, we have about 13 minutes, to be precise, for questions, and I'd encourage you all to take advantage of these experienced panelists with your questions and comments. Well, we have so many.
I have one.
That it's hard to choose among you.
I'm very interested in the cooperative economic model for communities to begin to engage resources around building businesses that are worker-owned and doing nonprofits that are actually owned by the clients and shareholders in the nonprofit field. I run a small nonprofit. I benefit from being part of Third Sector New England, which is a cooperative, provides cooperative back-of-the-house services to my small nonprofit and allows me to pay my employees well and provide decent benefits to them that I could not have as a small nonprofit, and I can engage in my social impact investing in a different way because I'm cooperatized. So I'm just wondering what you all are thinking about and talking about in terms of worker cooperatives, educating young kids about cooperative education. I think it's great to teach, prevent domestic violence through teaching about caring about pets. What about promoting new cooperative ways of doing business for young people so that they can begin to establish some changes in our economic landscape?
Thank you for that. That's a great question. We actually looked at that extensively in our immigrant entrepreneurship report. Many of the, as you probably know, worker cooperatives that are cropping up around the country are immigrant-led. There are a couple right here in the Boston area. New England's got exceptional resources, you know, with lots of nonprofits working in cooperatives for decades now. So if I was a Gateway City mayor, I think, you know, trying to get some cooperatives started in the community would be something that I would be really interested in. We've also looked at it from the angle of the education work. I think one of the things that's really interesting is work-based learning models. The vocational schools do them very well. It's harder in a lot of gateway cities to offer work-based learning because there's just not as many large employers to provide those internships and externships and career exploration activities. So student-run enterprises, I think, are a model that is promising. But I also think a lot of that work is at the margin. You know, it would definitely make communities better over the long term. But you know, the focus on policy change to advocate for an agenda that's robust enough to generate real change in our gateway cities has to be priority number one.
Just sort of add one point on that. I think, although it's not precisely what you're asking about, the spirit of sort of ownership and kind of connection to the work in a very direct way is, I think, embedded in a lot of what was talked about earlier, in the sense that many of these cities, by virtue of their size, don't have the ability to speak with as loud a voice as they would like, and in the same way that an individual worker may have a hard time connecting with resources or advocating for their needs, to the extent that we're able to form collaboratives that really create a platform, that's a very powerful vehicle. So I think the cities that are participating in the Working Cities Challenge, the communities that are part of the Groundwork network, you know, there are a lot of examples that allow some of those sort of smaller entities you know, to really to work with one voice and to assemble resources. And so the more we can kind of layer that from an individual person in their neighborhood up through a larger collaboration, I think that's a very powerful opportunity.
I would just say that there's increasing research on the sort of systems approach or cross-pollination, which is sort of the basis of a collaborative. What are the things that we share in common and how do they intersect? And what are the things that we do uniquely that allows us to focus on our highest, most useful purpose? And we're seeing it in the nonprofit capacity building industry as there are larger collaboratives being built. There's a group called Crossroads, which is a group of independent consultants who work collaboratively and refer work out to each other and support each other. There's a group in California called the Olive Grove. And so I think that business model is taking hold in those who are working with nonprofits, and as it proves successful for those teaching nonprofits, it will then become a strategy that they encourage nonprofits to use. I think the other thing when you mention students is that there is an explosion across the country on sort of experiential learning through teams and games, and that's one of the reasons I love your model so much. And one of the examples here in Massachusetts is out of Brandeis University called Generous U. And Generous U is a student competition where students are encouraged to put in a proposal that encourages philanthropy and informed giving among their campus and to the benefit of the greater community, and they're awarded a cash prize. But again, it's the gaming theory, it's bringing teams of students together and then having them address a social issue. And I think those skills, as we teach them on the campus, then definitely translate into the next future of nonprofit leadership.
We have another question here in the front. Could you introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Sally Fuller. I'm from a Davis Foundation, a funder from Springfield, Mass. I've met many of you, worked with many of you, and one of the things I'd like to say, I have an example, and it touches on a lot of what each of you have been saying, where we have been working in a Davis Foundation is the backbone organization for a collective impact approach in Springfield, Mass. that's going to help kids read proficiently by the end of 3rd grade. And one of the funding opportunities that we took advantage of, and when you talk about how this is not a linear process and sort of things happen in communities the way they're going to happen because you get different people at the table at different times, with the support of DHCD, Arthur, we were able to pull together, because of our collaborative work, a program in one of our housing authority sites thinking about using housing as a platform for change. And with the Davis Foundation is a small foundation. We cannot do everything in our community, so we really understand the value of collective impact and developing partnerships. But what we were able to do with not very much money, but looking at our local housing authority and saying to our local housing authority, if we could get some funding, if we could fund you, would you think about involving parents in helping to change outcomes for 3rd grade reading? We know that the change needs to start at home and it needs to start at birth. And long story short, we have an initiative that is really making change, but the power of it has come from not very much money. I think in our community when we started this initiative, many of the nonprofits thought, okay, we're going to work with Davis and maybe there'll be some funding. Well, there wasn't much funding. We were funding infrastructure, but we have, through a collaborative process, leveraged incredible hundreds of thousands of dollars by the local teachers union wins a national grant, and they are able to do some home visiting in the housing authority and the schools that are adjacent to them. The local mental health provider wants to be able to provide help for children and families, but has trouble accessing families. So by working with the housing authority, going where the families are, at no cost to us, at no cost to anyone except the state, they are able to provide mental health resources for the moms who have clinical depression. And what's really been powerful is that by looking at an issue collectively and being willing to take time to figure out how we collaborate, not really knowing when we're going to be able to bring resources in, we've been able to leverage hundreds of thousands of dollars for these families and are looking to grow a program. The nonprofits in our community are giving their time and happy to have access to families to help change outcomes. I mean, so it's a very powerful process, and I just, as each of these panelists has talked, I've thought it works. It's not easy, it's really, really messy, but it works. So there wasn't a question in there, and for that I apologize.
And it takes time.
Time.
A long time. Anybody else have any comments on that? Thank you, Sally. Any other questions, Beck?
We have one.
There we go. I'm coming from a nonprofit in Boston. We work in mostly larger cities. So I'm curious, from those of you, I think, Jen, you touched on this a little bit, but for the others of you, and maybe Jen as well, if you have any feedback for nonprofits that would love to get involved in this kind of thing, and any kind of tips, steps, suggestions on how to do so.
I can start. One of the things I really, really encourage people is to go into this with an open mind. A lot of us bring these preconceived notions of who our allies are and who our partners are, and we set up meetings with those types of groups just like us, or we talk to funders that are narrowly within the area that we focus in. And some of the greatest aha moments that have led to the bigger and more successful outputs have happened when people who didn't exactly know how they were going to work together when they first had the conversation, but built a strong and trusting relationship, came across the resource, the opportunity, and the need at the same time and built it. So as a future nonprofit leader, I would definitely suggest that you look at groups who are doing good work that you admire. Maybe not directly in your sweet spot or your focus area, but their method is interesting or innovative. Their visibility is something you admire. Get an informational interview, have a conversation, build those relationships, because collaboration does take time. And if you can start it now, it's great.
Go ahead, Tamar.
You mentioned also working in big cities, and I want to say that one thing that we and our partners have found really promising about the work in small cities is that it's not, we believe that it is not as difficult to bring people together because it's a smaller place, and we see, I think, Living Cities, which works in only the biggest cities and usually the most troubled, like Detroit and Trenton, et cetera. One of the things that they've been very impressed about is the level of attention and leadership that they get in small cities, the fact that Mayor Wong is helping to set the agenda for all of this work and is involved on a daily basis in making decisions. I think there's a lot of potential for change in these cities because of the relatively small scale. And if I could actually just make a comment on Sally's comment earlier. I did want to say that the Working Cities Challenge is really leveraging the investment that local philanthropy has been making for so long. And in fact, the local teams have been supported and have developed their capacity largely because of the investments that you all have made. And that is part of an important part of the local match that they bring to the table. I think our hope is to raise that work up and raise the work that's been successful up and share it across cities.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question.
This question is for Tamar. You mentioned two of your initiatives or focus is to raise income in families by 1% a year over the next 15 years, and then also increase parental involvement in the schools. Can you comment a little bit more about the significance of that and your plans for doing that?
We have really encouraged teams to focus on the long-term outcomes they're seeking rather than the individual activities that they're going to be undertaking. So I think we know that any individual activity may be successful or may not be successful, but the bigger and more important question for us is how do you achieve large-scale change over a long period of time? And as far as we're concerned, if the teams are regularly checking in on their progress and they discover that an activity is not having the outcomes that they want, they should stop doing that activity. They're smart people. They should say, let's try X or Y, or let's change effort A in this way. And as long as that's consistent with the long-term outcome, we are going to be absolutely fine with that. So we really are trying to talk long-term outcome focused with metrics to establish progress all along the way rather than individual programs. And I also want to say to other philanthropy, we are supporting capacity. We're encouraging folks to spend our money on the backbone support that keeps these people, supports these people's work every day, because we know that that's what it takes to make progress.
And with that, I think we have to make way for the next plenary. So thank you everyone for coming, and thank you to our panelists. And I believe everyone is going to be here for the rest of the day, most of you. Yes. So we look forward to talking with you over lunch and through the rest of the afternoon. Thank you.